20 years ago, at my brother's kitchen table, he told me the marriage wouldn't last 2 years. He wasn't cruel about it. He said it the way you'd mention the weather, matter of fact, certain, like he was simply stating something everyone already knew. Robert, she's 34 years younger than you. Once the visa clears, she's gone. I didn't argue with him that night. I just nodded, finished my coffee, and drove home to the woman he was talking about, who was, at that exact moment, on the phone with her mother back in Cebu, laughing about something I couldn't understand a word of. That was 2 decades ago. My brother has since apologized, more than once, in his own quiet way, and the woman he was so certain would leave has spent the last 20 years beside me, through 2 surgeries, a business that failed and one that didn't, the deaths of both our fathers an ocean apart, and more ordinary Tuesday evenings than I could ever count. I'm not telling you this story to prove my brother wrong, though I suppose it does that. I'm telling you because I think a lot of people watching this have heard some version of what I heard at that kitchen table, about someone they love, or about their own relationship. And I want you to hear what actually happened in the 20 years between that comment and today, because it's a lot more complicated and a lot more honest than either he was right or he was wrong. I need to back up further than the kitchen table, because you should understand how ordinary the beginning actually was. I was 46, recently divorced, working a civil engineering contract that took me to Cebu for 8 months, overseeing a bridge repair project. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that, because I think people assume men in my position went looking for something specific, and I didn't. I was tired, professionally focused, and mostly interested in finishing the project and going home. I met Liza at a small restaurant near my hotel, where I ate dinner most nights, because it was quiet, and the owner didn't mind an American sitting alone with a newspaper. She worked there part-time, while finishing a nursing degree during the day. We talked. At first, the way you talk to someone who serves you dinner 4 nights a week. Pleasant, brief, forgettable to anyone watching. It became less brief over time. She'd sit for a few minutes during slow periods, and I found myself looking forward to those few minutes more than I wanted to admit to myself. She was sharp. Sharper than most people I worked with, honestly. Funny in a dry way that took me a few weeks to fully catch, and entirely unimpressed by the fact that I was American, which I noticed precisely because it was such a contrast to a few other interactions I'd had that year. I was there 8 months. By month 6, we were having dinner together on purpose instead of by accident. By month 7, I'd met her mother, her 2 sisters, and roughly a dozen cousins whose exact relation to her I never fully sorted out. By month 8, when my contract ended, I didn't want to leave, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that had nothing to do with the bridge. I want to be fair to my brother, and to everyone else who said some version of what he said, because I don't think most of them were being deliberately cruel. I think they were pattern matching, the way people do, based on stories they'd heard or half heard, the age gap, the country, the assumption that always seems to follow both.
The comments started before we were even married. A colleague, meaning well, asked me if I'd thought this through, in a tone that made clear he already assumed I hadn't.
An old friend from college sent me an article about visa fraud, unprompted, 3 weeks after I mentioned Liza's name for the first time. My own mother, gently, asked if I was certain, in the specific, careful way mothers ask questions they already know the answer they want to hear. Liza felt it too, and in some ways worse than I did, because the assumption cut 2 directions for her. Not just, he's being taken advantage of, but, she's the kind of woman who would do that. I remember her telling me, early on, about a distant relative who'd made a comment at a family gathering. Something about how convenient it was that she'd found an American right as she finished her nursing degree. She laughed it off in front of me. I don't think she was laughing on the inside. We got married 18 months after we met. Not rushed, not slow, just the pace that felt right for 2 people who'd actually taken the time to know each other. My brother's comment came 3 weeks before the wedding, at that kitchen table, over coffee he'd made specifically, I think, to soften whatever he was about to say. I don't want to pretend the early years were simple, because pretending would do a disservice to anyone watching this who's actually living through their own early years right now. The age gap was real, and it showed up in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. different cultural references, different energy levels some days, occasional moments where I'd catch myself worrying, privately, about what our life would look like when I was 75 and she was 41. The distance from her family was real too, and heavier on her than I think I fully understood at the time. She'd built a life around aunts, cousins, a mother she spoke to daily, and she traded daily physical closeness with all of that for a much smaller circle in a country whose language she was still learning. There were hard months. I remember a stretch in our third year when she cried, quietly, most evenings for almost 2 weeks, and when I finally asked what was wrong, she told me she missed her mother's voice in the same room, instead of through a phone screen, and that she sometimes wondered if she'd made the right choice, not about me, but about the distance itself. I want to be honest that this scared me, in a specific way, not because I doubted her feelings for me, but because I understood, clearly, for the first time, the size of what she'd actually given up to build a life with me. It wasn't a small sacrifice dressed up as romance. It was a real, heavy trade, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. What we did about it mattered more than the difficulty itself. We started calling her family together, weekly, so I became a real presence in those calls, instead of a name mentioned occasionally. We visited Cebu every year without exception. Even the year's money was tight, because I understood by then that her connection to home wasn't optional maintenance. It was as essential to her as air. 6 years into the marriage, I made a decision that nearly ended everything, though not the way my brother had predicted. I left my engineering contract to start a small consulting firm with a former colleague. It failed within 2 years, more completely than either of us anticipated. Bad timing. A partner who made decisions I didn't find out about until the damage was done, and a recession that hit small consulting firms particularly hard. We lost most of our savings. For a period of nearly a year, our finances were genuinely precarious in a way they'd never been before, even in Liza's early years adjusting to a new country. I remember the specific night I told her how bad it actually was. Not the softened version I'd been giving her for months, but the real number, the one that meant we might lose the house. I braced myself, if I'm honest, for the moment my brother had predicted years earlier to finally arrive. I thought, somewhere in the back of my mind I'm not proud of, that this was the test. That if the marriage had ever been about anything other than genuine partnership, this was where it would show. She didn't leave. She got angry. Briefly. Not at me exactly, but at the situation. The way any spouse would. Then she did something I still think about. She went back to nursing, full-time, for the first time since our early years, and within 8 months her income had stabilized us, more than my failed consulting attempt ever had. She never once mentioned my brother's comment, though I know she remembered it as clearly as I did. She simply went to work, every day, alongside me, rebuilding something neither of us had expected to need rebuilding. I think that year taught me something about the actual shape of the doubt people like my brother carry. The assumption isn't really about visas or age gaps. It's about whether someone will stay when staying stops being easy. Liza answered that question in the hardest possible year, not with words, but with 8 months of double shifts at a hospital, 40 minutes from our house. Grief is where I think a marriage either becomes real or reveals that it never quite was, and we went through it twice, an ocean apart, 4 years from each other. Her father passed first, when we'd been married 11 years. I flew with her to Cebu within 18 hours of the call, sat through a funeral conducted almost entirely in a language I still only partially understood, and stood beside her at the grave as the only foreigner in a crowd of relatives, most of whom I'd met exactly once before. I didn't need to understand every word being spoken to understand what my presence there meant to her, that this wasn't a marriage where her family existed on the periphery of my life, but one where I showed up, fully, for the parts of her world that had nothing to do with me at all. My own father passed 4 years later, in the town I'd grown up in, at a funeral filled with faces Liza had come to know over more than a decade of holidays and visits. My brother, the same brother from that kitchen table, pulled me aside afterward and told me something I've held on to since.
He said, "Robert, I watched Liza with Dad these last few years. I watched how she took care of him near the end, how she sat with Mum for hours after the diagnosis. I was wrong about her. I was wrong a long time ago, and I should have said so sooner.
I want to be careful here, because I don't think that apology is the point of this story, and I don't think Liza needed it to validate 2 decades of a real marriage. But I'll admit it mattered to me, hearing my own brother finally see clearly what had been true the entire time. That the woman he'd dismissed at a kitchen table 20 years earlier had shown up, consistently, for every hard thing a marriage actually requires, long after any visa had cleared, and any assumption should have quietly died on its own. Even now, 20 years in, the assumption doesn't fully disappear. It just changes shape. Strangers still occasionally ask questions with a particular tone, a careful phrasing that assumes something underneath the surface of a simple introduction. A new acquaintance at a dinner party, a year or so ago, asked Liza, with what I think she believed was genuine curiosity, "So how did you two end up together?" And something in the way she asked it made clear she was really asking a different question entirely, one about motive rather than history. Liza has gotten better at handling it than I have, honestly. She usually just tells the actual story. The restaurant, the nursing degree, the 8 months of dinner conversations before anything romantic began, told plainly enough that the assumption underneath the question quietly deflates on its own, without her ever needing to address it directly. I think what people who ask those questions don't account for is math. A relationship built purely on a transaction doesn't survive a failed business, 2 funerals, a decade of ordinary Tuesday evenings, and the 1,000 small, unglamorous choices that make up an actual life together. Whatever motive someone might have started with, and I don't believe Liza's was ever what my brother assumed, 20 years is a very long time to sustain a performance. At some point, if it were only ever a transaction, the transaction would have ended. This one just kept becoming, instead, an actual marriage. Liza is 52 now. I'm 68. The age gap that worried my mother 2 decades ago hasn't disappeared, but it stopped mattering in the way anyone predicted it would. She still works part-time as a nurse, 3 days a week, mostly because she likes the work, not because we need the income the way we once did. I retired 4 years ago, fully this time, and spend my mornings in a small garden that Liza started the year after her father passed. Something she said reminded her of the plants around her childhood home. We call her mother every Sunday, all 3 of us on video now, her mother's face lit up by whatever ring light one of Liza's nieces set up for her without asking. We visit Cebu twice a year now, instead of once. I know most of her extended family by name, know which cousin recently had a baby, which aunt makes the specific dish Liza still can't quite replicate on her own, no matter how many times she asks for the recipe. I am, in every meaningful sense, part of a family that started, 20 years ago, as a stranger my brother assumed was only passing through. We had a small anniversary dinner last year, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant not unlike the one where we met. I asked her, half joking, if she remembered my brother's comment from that kitchen table. She laughed, the same laugh from the restaurant in Cebu 22 years earlier, and said, "Robert, I remember every word. I just decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let a stranger's guess about my life become true just because he said it with confidence." I want to say something plainly, because I think it matters beyond just my own marriage. The assumption my brother made 20 years ago, that a relationship with an age gap and a border between 2 countries must be explained by something other than genuine love, isn't just unkind. It's usually just wrong. Or at minimum, it's an incomplete guess, dressed up as certainty. It ignores the actual daily texture of what a real partnership requires, showing up for grief in a language you don't fully speak, rebuilding finances together after a failure, learning to call someone's mother every single Sunday for 2 decades without fail. I don't say this to suggest every relationship people are suspicious of is automatically genuine. I'm sure some genuinely aren't, and I don't think skepticism itself is unreasonable as a starting point for strangers who don't know the full story. What I'd ask, instead, is that people extend the same patience to unconventional relationships that they'd extend to conventional ones. The patience of actually watching what happens over years, rather than deciding the ending based on the first chapter alone. Liza taught me that, more than I taught her anything. She never argued with the assumption. She just kept showing up, year after year, until the assumption simply couldn't survive the evidence anymore. If you're in a relationship that other people have decided, from the outside, to be suspicious of, an age gap, a different country, a story that doesn't fit the shape people expect, I want to tell you what 20 years taught me. You don't have to argue with the assumption. You don't have to prove anything to anyone at a kitchen table who's already decided what they believe before they've watched a single real year of your life unfold. You just have to keep showing up, honestly, for the actual difficult, unglamorous work that any real partnership requires. The failed business, the funeral in a language you're still learning, the Sunday phone call you never miss. 20 years ago, my brother was certain he knew how this story would end. He was wrong, not because I proved a point to him, but because Liza and I simply lived an actual life together, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, until the ending he predicted became impossible for anyone paying attention to still believe. If this story means something to you, whether you're in a relationship people doubt, or you're the one doing the doubting about someone else's, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. I read every one, and I think there's more real love in the stories people assume are transactions than most of us are willing to admit. I'll see you in the next one. Before I go, I want to say one more thing, directly to people like my brother was, 20 years ago. Not to shame anyone, because I don't think he deserved shame. He was simply repeating an assumption he'd absorbed from somewhere else. If you're the one doing the doubting right now, about your own child, your sibling, your friend, I'd ask you to consider something. The certainty you feel, the confidence that lets you say something like, "It won't last 2 years," at a kitchen table, isn't actually knowledge. It's a guess wearing knowledge's clothes. My brother wasn't malicious. He simply mistook a pattern he'd heard about for a fact he actually knew. What would have happened, I sometimes wonder, if he'd said something different that night? Not doubt dressed as certainty, but an honest question instead. "Robert, tell me about her." I would have talked for an hour. I would have told him about the 8 months of dinners, about how she argued with me about engineering problems she had no formal training in, and was usually right anyway, about the specific way she laughed at herself when she mispronounced something in English. He might have understood, faster, what took him 15 more years to see clearly. I'm not angry that he doubted us. I understand why he did. I only wish, now, that more people extended the curiosity before the certainty. Ask the question before delivering the verdict. If I could sit across from the 46-year-old version of myself, 3 weeks before that wedding, nervous about what my family thought, here's what I'd tell him. You don't owe anyone a defense of a relationship you already know is real. You'll want to argue, to build a case, to list evidence that proves your brother wrong. Don't bother. Evidence delivered in an argument convinces no one. Evidence delivered by 20 years of ordinary life convinces everyone eventually, including the people who doubted you first. I'd also tell him something Liza taught me without ever saying it directly. Love that has to prove itself constantly to outside observers isn't more real than love that simply gets on with the quiet work of living. She never once tried to perform devotion for my family's benefit. She just showed up, consistently, for 2 decades, and let the performance-free consistency speak for itself. And I'd tell him one more thing, the thing I understand most clearly only now, looking back from 68 instead of 46. The years people warned you would be the hardest, the early ones, the ones with the biggest age gap, the biggest cultural distance, usually aren't. The hardest years are the ordinary middle ones, the failed business, the grief, the Tuesday you're both too tired to be kind to each other. Nobody warns you about those years because they don't fit as neatly into a warning about visas. Liza asked me, when I told her I was making this video, why I wanted to tell this story now, 20 years in, instead of 5 years ago, or 10. I told her the truth. I think enough time has finally passed that the story isn't really about defending our marriage anymore. Nobody needs convincing at this point. The evidence is a shared home, 2 decades of Sundays, a garden she planted after her father died. The story now is really just us. Ordinary, unremarkable, 20 years of us. That, I think, is the actual quiet victory in stories like this one. Not proving the doubters wrong dramatically, in one triumphant moment, but simply outlasting the doubt entirely, living so plainly and consistently that the original suspicion becomes irrelevant, then forgotten, then eventually, for people like my brother, something to look back on with a kind of gentle embarrassment. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with our story. If there's a relationship in your own life, yours or someone else's, that people have judged too quickly, I hope this gave you something to sit with. And if you're the one who did the judging once, the way my brother did, it's never too late to say what he eventually said to me. I was wrong, and I should have said so sooner. I'll see you in the next one.